Welcome back after lunch in lovely Davis, California. The session that we are having now is sort of the targeted endpoint goal of the whole meeting here, which is to talk about how we as a society and we as institutions assess scholars. So we've talked about publishing and different types of publishing and peer review and metrics, but of course, if we want to affect any type of change, we have to both understand and have ways of changing how institutions, whether they be funding agencies or universities or other institutions, actually carry out assessment and the reward systems that are in place. We will have a few speakers, but it is my great pleasure to introduce the Chancellor of UC Davis, Linda Katehi, who we prodded her to be controversial, so if there's anything controversial here, it's our fault, not hers. It's been a really wonderful time to be at UC Davis from my point of view with someone at the top who is actually really interested in affecting change at the institution. So I look forward to hearing from her.
Thank you. Well, it was only one way going with Jonathan organizing this conference, and of course it was being provocative. So I would like to do that today, and I will do it in a way to start asking questions that I believe will really benefit us as an institution, rather than trying to make change quickly, because some of these areas, specifically assessment on university campuses, is one of the most fundamental things we do as the academy, and of course, one very hard to change for very good reasons in many ways, and for some not so good reasons in other ways. So I wanted to start by saying that of course, as we know, one of the most time and effort intensive tasks in a university is the review for promotion and tenure. And I will focus on that because many other reviews and assessments we make more or less resemble that one. The process, of course, this process is central to the academy and in many ways has been considered by many of us as the gateway to achieving academic quality and excellence. The process, as we know, has exhibited long endurance and has a very rigid definition to successful performance. The most interesting attribute of this effort, this process, is that it tries to judge quality with metrics from another era. And that happens because processes like that stay with us for a long time, and we find it hard to question their effectiveness and their importance as part of the institution. This is my fourth university, and I have observed this process in 4 different institutions. And every experience, despite its own uniqueness, drives me to believe that this process is not just intense, but very invasive to the intellectual life of the faculty. My experiences have made me believe that the tenure and promotion process, as it is practiced today, is actively changing the creative nature of our young scholars into more of a mainstream, middle of the road, and risk adverse, forcing all the faculty, young faculty who go through this process, to fit an old and outdated mold. As a scientist, I have learned that an invasive measurement and assessment process is not a good one. What it does, because it really changes the nature of what we try to measure. And as a result, a process that does that needs to change. So I would dare to make the argument that an assessment process that restricts creativity and risk-taking is not a good process for a university that aspires to reach excellence. To see why tenure processes have been totally outdated, to remember that in the humanities, our process calls for having at least one book published when books are quickly replaced by other media. The same process in the sciences calls for reviewed publications when blogs and open publishing is far more interesting for the authors and far more important and provides a better space for review and debate. This existing process struggles to recognize new communications media and struggles to redefine the meaning of review. So in my career, I have seen hundreds of promotion and tenure reviews, and what I have observed is really the same on every of the 4 institutions I have been affiliated with, and I consider it to be very interesting as an observation itself. So if we assess the hiring and recruiting process, including the intensity and thoroughness of the effort, it does not help, but it forces me to ask what the value of the tenure review is. The negative cases, because I see those in all of my roles, I've spent a lot more time on the negative cases than I've spent on the positive cases, as you can imagine. So those few negative cases that I have seen during a review that have resulted from a review process, first of all, are so few, and most of the time so questionable or controversial because there are opposing points of view, that forces one to ask why not giving tenure the moment someone is hired. To understand this, this is a very provocative thought, obviously, but leads us to a number of questions, and I would like, in fact, to start asking those questions today. So have we imagined how would a university look if every incoming faculty member, which of course is elected after a very excruciating and intense hiring process, has tenure? How would it be if a promotion or review process is only to make sure that the individual remains creative, remains active, relevant, and makes an impact in the lives of students, in addition, of course, to the expected impact in his or her intellectual community? How would the university be if the senior faculty were to actively participate in mentoring junior faculty, and if the success of the junior faculty were to become a metric of the work of the senior faculty? What if faculty participated only in assessing quality, but not in setting salaries? What would this do to the university? How would this change our ability to achieve excellence? Asking these questions may not necessarily force us to change what we have in place, but I dare to believe that it will allow us to develop a better process that will help the university, this university, achieve excellence with the expectations that we have living in the 21st century. So that is my thesis. Thank you.
All right, now chew on that for a little bit. All right, our next speaker is Sarah Green, who I think is going to connect her own computer from Rapid Science, talking about how we change models of doing science, I think, and getting people to collaborate more. Would that be good?
That's good. Let's see. Oops. Sorry about that. Thanks. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's my anniversary, the 127th day of Rapid Science. I'm very new. A lot of these ideas are in my head. But Rapid Science crystallizes much of what I've strived for in 30 years of publishing. In particular, a commitment to encourage scientists to reach outside of their specialized disciplines and participate in the larger world. This started with a project I developed in the 80s, pre-web, called Current Protocols, which was methods manuals. And a community was built around that based on postcards that were mailed to me that suggested better ways of doing things and pointed out mistakes. And it really became a community, mainly because we gave out cult status T-shirts that were said "Never clone alone." From there, I created a couple web magazines that brought together the disciplines of biology and medicine, one of them with Ivan Oransky. Also achieved cult status and put in a sprinkling of culture as well. But I've also developed, I've done work with Faculty of 1,000, communities there that has had its own challenges. And I've worked with patients, and that leads me to what I want to talk about today. It is really, it's larger than the world of biomedicine, but that's what I'm piloting my project in, because that's been my most recent work. I worked with the consumer group when I built the New York Times digital health vertical. I started the Society for Participatory Medicine. I know a lot about patients and what their needs are and how researchers can help them, but how the current structure of academia in particular stops them and makes progress slow down. So I'm fortunate to be working with and have as my champion Dr. Bruce Alberts, who recently stepped down as the editor of Science. He's been my champion. He recently joined my board of directors, and he warned me not to describe this project as publishing, but as a new paradigm for conducting biomedical or translational science. In fact, he believes this is the anti-publishing project. Francis Collins, too, has expressed enthusiasm via his "We Need to Think New Ways" mantra. I'm sure many of you have heard him say that. And both he and Harold Varmus at NCI have helped me point me towards projects where I believe these ideas can be piloted. I wanted to point out this quote by Casavadel and Fang. It's, I think, a really important way to think about collaboration. There's needs to be this connectivity between disciplines, not just in biomedicine, but I think in many of the disciplines that you're in as well. A different reward system could promote team science and thus promote the overall progress of the scientific enterprise. Every field does have its own examples. I've been working in the field of precision oncology, where every person's tumor is now known to have its own profile of mutations and therefore respond quite differently to the available targeted and immunotherapies, as well as the experimental therapies. So combining sequence data with the outcomes of patients that exist in every community doctor's file cabinets is just incredibly important in terms of finding and uncovering new targets and new potential drugs. And those are solutions that can immediately help patients. So that is why I refer to this as rapid science. The sad reality is this quote that I've heard over and over, literally over and over, working on 2 collaborative grants involving dozens of PIs in their labs. Despite the fact that they're working with 300 late-stage cancer patients who were their study subjects, they were not willing to share their most recent data, only their published data, because they were afraid that they would be scooped. So some of the solutions that I am proposing really is to provide tools, processes, and incentives, with incentives underlined, to share, analyze, discuss, publish, and contextualize results as a group process. So I'm allowed by Bruce to say publish if I say group publish. The elements all work together to, I hope, to realize this dream, to create an open source infrastructure to record and analyze results. So this is the collaboration platform. To enable secure access levels, because scientists do really want to be sure that they can share with small groups, and then, like Google Circles, open it up to larger groups. To reinvent the peer review process as self-organizing in real time by peers from multiple institutions and disciplines who are on the platform. So it's happening as the research is being looked at. It's not happening at arm's length. And that's, I also like to call that organic peer review. But this session is not about peer review, so I won't go into that. To publish continually updated consensus reviews that reflect the latest findings that are happening on the platform. So there's many groups out here who are wanting to publish incremental results, and it's not been entirely successful because you have a dangling table of results that is not given context. So the evidence reviews that we're creating put all that together, provide the context for the incremental results that are published next door to it. To facilitate a feedback loop from clinic to research via clearinghouse of computable case reports and of one studies and trial summations. It's shocking to me that that doesn't exist. But that is something that the field needs. And I think that as you drill into your own special field, you find things that shockingly are not there and that you can provide, and that provide a seed for the community that you want to formulate. And last but not least, really what the core of this talk is to incentivize participation by implementing a reward metric system that would be adopted by funders and administrators to advance careers. I call this the C-score for collaboration. I have been very much influenced by Michael Nielsen's book, which probably many of you have read, but if you haven't, I highly recommend it, Reinventing Discovery, The New Era of Network Science. It's from a couple of years ago. But having a metric that can actually measure activities and score activities, I know there are so many questions about that. Many people say, how can you do that without bias? But how can you have a system that scores what people publish without bias? I mean, it's just something that is very, very hard to design, and I'm working with some really fantastic reputation experts from all walks of life. Wikimedia Foundation is interested in helping me to develop this because they've already developed such a system for Wikipedia. And I hope that if this could be widely adopted after it's proven to be successful in this pilot system, that it really will sit side by side with all of the alt metrics and regular metrics and high impact factor that people now use to judge scientists' careers. Just very quickly, this is to show that on the collaboration platform, all of these elements, all of these tasks that researchers perform are happening on the collaboration platform. So as this being a way to pilot it, it really can be measured. And these are all elements that scientists do in all walks of life, but by concentrating them on the collaboration platform, it allows us to figure out what the measures are, what the possible biases are, and hopefully be extended to a much larger audience and a universal audience ultimately. This is just one of our prototypes. We developed some design prototypes to show in our work with these other grants that we were on. This shows the user's homepage with the dashboard of all the information that's coming through on the platform. Not to go into that too much, but it shows on your right the C-score and how that can be measured over time, and it can be shown by project. So if a funder wants to judge the grantees, the scientists' contribution over time, you can look at it by project, and I think that's the way that it will be the most useful. And there's many ways that it can be measured. These are just a few. But, you know, there are projects out there, such as the Myeloma Repair Foundation, where these foundations really are conscious, and they're out there in the field looking at what the researchers are doing, who they fund. And there's not very many of them, surprisingly, but I think this could help to make it much easier so you don't have to fly to every lab to try to figure it out. So this is just to say that we've got our stick and our carrot, and I think that funders can really wield this stick. I'm hoping, I've already, as I mentioned, got NIH interested. Stand Up to Cancer is one of the groups I worked with. They're the second biggest funder of cancer research in the US, and foundations in industry. The carrot is, I'm sorry to say, publication. It's, I just don't think one can do this without publication. And every research project that's on the collaboration platform will ultimately have work coming out of it that the group has produced, and so that work needs to be published. In my case, what I'm developing is the Precision Oncology Journal, where the incremental research can sit side by side with the work that the group has created, which is the bigger piece of work. In my case, in the case of Rapid Science, that's the evidence review. So this is just to show how groups can work on it and can make comments and can revise it and eventually publish it. That's really it. The heart of the matter is that scientists are going to want to do it because they want to help patients. There are more ahas, they will learn, and there's the element of peer production, which we learned about from Dr. Benkler, where one person can't do it, but many people can. And that's Rapid Science. Many thanks to the funders thus far. to all the people who have helped me, and please read more about it. And if you would like to partner or fund, I have candy for you. So, thanks very much.
It's no fair. It's Valentine's Day, and no one else brought candy. All right, our next speaker is Margie Ferguson, who, in addition to being a professor at UC Davis, is the president of the Modern Language Association and has diverse, director, executive, right. Yesterday we had the executive director of everything. And has certainly diverse experiences with debates about assessing scholarship. Are you using the computer? Okay.
I always have to lower this. Can everybody hear? Okay. Well, I'm very happy to be here. This is very exciting, and I wish that I'd been able to be at more of it. I'm also trying to plan a meeting for next week where I'm trying to do what my boss or my collaborator, the executive director of the Modern Language Association, wants me to do. And it's definitely improved my understanding of collaboration as not simply an alternative to individual ego-driven work, but as a new version of it. They are not totally separate. They do blend, I think, in most of our experiences of scholarship. So I wanted to start with, let me take my watch off so I know that I'm on time. Time is going to be an issue here. I wanted to start by quoting from a fascinating book by William Clark called Academic Charisma and the Origins of the Research University, which came out in 2006 from Chicago. In this book, William Clark discusses the introduction of a new kind of metric, which is part of a new, he claims, understanding of measurement in itself. He posits a change in the specific example of the recommendation letter during the Enlightenment. But the recommendation letter turns out to be a venue for a lot of other kinds of questions about what assessment of work is when the workers are in this new institution called the Research University in Germany. He sees the recommendation letter as exhibiting its epical newness. When it comes from a Prussian university, he's examined the archives of several Prussian universities, where before about 1740, most of the recommendation letters for new professors in various disciplines involved testimonials to something like their character. The testimonial letter spoke of wealth, including number of books that you owned, your handsomeness, your demeanor, and also your high birth. All of these things were mentioned and discussed in the testimonial letter. Starting, and he isn't saying there's an exact starting date, but somewhere on or about the middle of the 18th century, he starts to find letters that are, they focus on expert advice. And in these letters, candidates are praised for the amount of applause that they get in their lectures, and also for some other qualities of their work. These letters start to have negatives in them, as well as positives. The testimonial letter only had positives, let me tell you, and we may be coming back to that. But the letters started to have a veneer of objectivity to assess how someone was doing, and you weren't supposed to be his friend or his father or his mother. Well, you were supposed to be someone who was thinking about the good of the university and the state, which sponsored and paid for the university. The new criterion of applause indicated interest in the candidate's success in the lecture hall, and I guess you could say that's a good thing, but it also signified fame in the eyes of the world. And I think that this is interesting just in light of the quotation that we just saw, suggesting that rapid science would give us, if it acquired the same cachet as other kinds of less collaborative science, then that would be the goal. So what is cachet? How is cachet different from applause? And how, more generally, is it different from fame? Or what a scholar named Jim English has called the culture of prestige, which he sees us all in across disciplines where prizes have multiplied and where prize getting and funding is part of what counts for excellence in the nonprofit sector of the university. So the historical shift that Clark discusses is by no means completed, I would say. It's still occurring recursively across an international field of discourse that responds enigmatically and unevenly to economic and institutional pressures when it is asked to judge quality of work along with signs of what we call productivity, which are often measured, as Linda Katei said, with metrics from another era, but which could still be boiled down fairly to questions of quantity. I think all of the disciplines that I know and have come to know more of by being associated with the MLA are struggling with this problem, quality versus quantity. And behind that is another problem which Kant, in his essay on the two faculties, discussed as a difference between disciplines that create visible utility for their society and disciplines, he called them the higher faculty, but I would not put them in a hierarchy, especially given where I stand and where I work from, disciplines that engage in what he calls critique. And those are the disciplines that humanists often say that they're defending when they say they do scholarship and criticism rather than research. And they don't want to be put into that category of those who do things that are so obviously important for society. A cure for any kind of cancer, the most rare kind, would be, in this metric, worth all of the books that are coming out of any English department. And I probably wouldn't disagree with that at some level. On the other hand, as someone trained in the humanities, I say that we are not looking for a metric. We're looking for metrics. We're looking for a network of measurements, some of which know that some things cannot be easily measured. And that would be the kind of network that we need in a research university where all of our disciplines are actually contributing to each other, and where we believe, at least, or I believe, that we are, as a university, more than the sum of our parts. Now, Kant defined critique, as Michael Holquist explains in a very interesting article done for Teagle Foundation volume on measurement in various disciplines. If I had a PowerPoint, I would show you the cover, but since I don't, I'll be happy to tell anyone afterwards the bibliographical details for this very interesting volume. Kant, as filtered through Holquist, says that the work of critique is to question the claims that show that any claim that the current state of knowledge is self-evident. So those are the claims that Kuhn talks about in the scientific revolutions, the paradigm shifts, and they often come from the margins in any discipline. And these are not the margins of the profit. The profit motive that I was learning about from Yochai Benkert yesterday, these are the margins where junior faculty inhabit the field, where people who may not be thinking in the ways that not just their elders, but their more famous colleagues think. How do we nourish and foster that? And it's not just in the humanities, it's across our disciplines. I think we would agree that that's part of what we mean by quality, is supporting those claims that come from the edges or the margins. And I don't know how to do that. I think that people who have served on personnel committees at private and public universities are constantly negotiating this, and I think we're not going to have a quick answer. But I think that those metrics do need to think about those disciplines where we can't quite do things as fast as perhaps is indicated in a title like Rapid Science. The disciplines of the humanities and history are, and geology in many ways, involved in trying to understand slow tempos of the past, not just things that take a long time to read, like Paradise Lost, but things that came out of a culture that had a different understanding of time, or that had a different understanding of productivity. The cultures of Native American, indigenous peoples in many ways resemble the cultures of the late Middle Ages in Europe, where you had an open field system of agriculture that was called the commons. And Mario and I have an argument to be had about whether pastures and an agricultural land-based model of the commons is still available in the modern world. I think it is because of environmental issues, but that's another topic. What I wanted to say here is that there has to be some way in the very interesting discussions of metrics that we're having, which focus on innovation and change, to make room for those scholars who are not sharing that value, perhaps, by the nature of their work. And one of my colleagues from an earlier part of my life, who now has written for the MLA an article on metrics of assessing humanities scholarship, has several pages on why scholarship and research are not the same thing and require different metrics that allow for the merely utilitarian and the critical in the humanities, that allow us to distinguish on that ground, which is not to say that utilitarian is the term of abuse. The moral act, which we are all benefiting from, says specifically that these land-grant universities will be focusing on the agricultural and the mechanic arts. And I've recently been reading the debates about that act. It took it several years to come through because people thought that it was incipient socialism to turn over land to a educational enterprise that had something like the public or the common good in mind, even only through mechanical arts and agricultural results that were going to be directly beneficial in ways people could see immediately. So I think that this is not going to be easy, but I do think that the question of collaborative work versus the individual is worth pursuing across the disciplines. And I wanted to give just two examples of ways in which collaborative work in the humanities is going forward, clearly influenced by models in the sciences and by our reward system, which tends to privilege productivity as it can be measured in relatively easy ways. At least quantity is an easy way. One of these examples is Franco Moretti's lab at Stanford, which does what he calls distant reading, uses big data to think about what might have been called the sociology of literature. How do things get published? In what numbers? What what are the things we couldn't actually find out until we had some way of assessing big data. And other projects are going forward that are using digital databases such as Early English Books Online. We simply couldn't ask certain questions until this kind of collection, this kind of addition to scholarship was possible and speeded it up. And Moretti's work may be the most interesting thing going on, at least in the West Coast at the moment. The other example is one that I think is quite interesting and that might go back to the problem of the commons, the concept of the commons as a way of sharing goods that is not reducible to either fame or the profit motive. And this is an experiment that was conducted by a group of humanities scholars, one of whom is in the English department here, and they conducted it in Irvine under the DHI's rubric, and that's a institutional rubric for collaborative work. They published their work as a book entitled Speculate This, and it was published under the name of Author Uncertain Commons. Now, my colleague tells me that the press that published this, which is prestigious, it has cachet, Duke University Press, hated this idea. How can we publish something without an author, without an individual author? But this collective prevailed. And therefore, the book is now out, and I would like to know how we can think about a reward system that would actually allow us to count what is not countable in terms of an individual's name or his or her intellectual property. Thank you.
We should have made all the speakers anonymous. All right, so our next speaker is going to be joining us via Skype due to weather conditions in the East Coast. And we're going to see if this works. Oh, that's great. We can see you now. I don't know, you probably can see me, but nothing else.
Yes.
Is Carrie Ann O'Meara from University of Maryland, who has been involved, among many things, in research on the academic reward system itself, and is also involved in the University of Maryland Advanced Project, and we hope to have you back out, or actually physically out, to talk about advance-related topics too. So I'm going to turn it over to you on the computer now. All right?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. And Allison, just let me know if for some reason it starts to freeze. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be talking with you, despite the fact that the weather did not, I have about a foot of snow outside, and it was very hard to get out, but it sounds like a wonderful conference, and I appreciate all the speakers I've gotten to listen to, even in just this way. So, as was just said, I come to this topic of faculty evaluation from several perspectives. One of them is, having studied academic reward systems, I'm a faculty in a college of education, so I study higher education and academic reward systems, using a variety of survey, case study kinds of methods. I'm also co-director of our advanced grant, which of course is focused on trying to create better work environments for women in faculty in ways that improve them for everybody. I'm a consultant that works with campuses that are actually trying to change their promotion and tenure guidelines. And very recently, I had the opportunity to serve on our own University of Maryland P&T task force. So I've been thinking about some of these things. So if we can move to the next slide, why change? I think many of these have been articulated probably really well throughout the conference. But to just summarize a couple of them that that strike me is that, of course, many of the most familiar features of higher ed and faculty careers that we're familiar with were designed between 1865 and 1925, from things like 3 credits in professional schools, graduate schools distinct from undergrad, and tenure. So today we, of course, have a new set of faculty. a new set of scholarship and realities, and we need to redesign our organizational practices in order to meet up with those challenges, or rather, and opportunities as they present themselves. Also, you don't have to, every day the Chronicle and Inside Higher Education acknowledge yet another case throughout our system of research universities in particular, where interdisciplinary scholars, women, faculty of color are disenfranchised by promotion and tenure processes that are not rewarding engaged scholarship or the work that they're doing, where bias is implicit in the process. So we clearly have a situation where, as Susan Sturm at Columbia has phrased, we don't have an architecture for full inclusion. And I think the goal is that we want our promotion and tenure process to create an architecture for full inclusion of newer forms of scholarship and for newer entrants into the academy. If we can go to the next slide. So to do that, we have to think about what some of the assumptions are that we want to change, or at least question. And I really appreciated your chancellor's comments on this, got me thinking quite a bit. But, just to pick three that are on this list, assumptions to challenge about the pathways of excellent work. I think operating as a narrative in many of our heads, including those of us that sit on promotion and tenure committees at our institutions and have been through the process ourselves, is a certain kind of bill becomes a law assumption about the pathway of excellent work, that it, is done by people who come out of really great graduate programs and gets in the best journals, is acknowledged in the best disciplinary associations, and that's how we know that it's good. And of course, newer forms of scholarship and people who have not had the same sponsorship from scholars in different areas are not going to necessarily have their work in that pathway, and that doesn't mean that we don't understand it as excellent work. We need to challenge assumptions about disciplinary experts as the only peer review process, and clearly your conference has done much of that. And just to pick a third one to highlight, this idea of promotion and tenure as unbiased and objective. Obviously, and I recently wrote an op-ed about this in Inside Higher Ed. Obviously, we bring humans to the process, and we're all biased. If there are not policies in place that specifically tell us to acknowledge and understand and try to understand newer forms of scholarship, then we fall back on what we know. And what we know is largely what we were socialized to know throughout our own trajectories, which again goes back to the reason why we may be squelching some of new scholars' kinds of work that was mentioned previously. So if we go to the next slide, changes needed. So one of the things that I mentioned before that I often, that I do, because I am I very much am committed, as all of you are, to the change we need to see. And I like to help campuses actually get policy language in hand to go to task on different aspects of their policies that could be better constructed in order to evaluate forms of scholarship. So here are five, and I'm going to just provide a brief example of each one. If we can go to the next page. So this has been around now for at least 20 years. Certainly places like Syracuse, University of Memphis, Northern Kentucky, Michigan State, University of West Sydney. I could go on, and there are many, many examples of campuses that used Ernest Boyer's broadened definition of scholarship, that expanded scholarship to not only discovery, but the integration, engagement, transmission, translation of knowledge. Many campuses have expanded their definitions of scholarship, and actually the University of Maryland is in that process itself, but also have tied their mission and who they're about very much to diverse forms of scholarship, and have done other things within their promotion and tenure processes to allow folks to organize their CV, to advertise in their hiring that they want scholars involved in this work. So that's one key change that can happen. If we go to the next slide, criteria to evaluate scholarship. So I know this has been another main focus of the conference, and clearly if we're to have newer forms of scholarship emerging, and if we're to have faculty with priorities that have expanded to things like K through 16 work, or using critical race theory, qualitative methodologies that are unfamiliar to many. If we're going to do interdisciplinary work and be doing digital work, we need to have an expanded set of criteria that are appropriate to all forms of scholarship, but are also, as Mallard, Lamont, and Getzkow have talked about, they're contextualized. So they're appropriate to what we're trying to evaluate. So if somebody, for example, in health equity is the main purpose of the engaged scholarship that they're doing is to impact how doctors think about their patients and how they frame their conversations with them and their the kinds of ways that they think about alternatives, then we of course would want to see some of their work evaluated in peer-reviewed journals, but we would also want to know whether it's actually changed anything at the American Medical Association and in actual doctors' offices. And so we need to expand how we think about these indicators in ways that are appropriate to the form that the scholarship is taking. And that might mean that leads to a lot of implications also for that documentation of scholarship, which is actually the next slide that we could go to. Legitimate products of scholarship is actually where the rubber hits the road in promotion and tenure guidelines, because even if we say we've expanded the definition of scholarship and that people's work will be evaluated on its impact, its significance, and its peer review, and we say that they can make the case for that based on the appropriateness of the work, then it comes down to a point in someone's individual college or department guidelines where, you know, there's a group of people who have come in with a sense of what's real scholarship, which tends to follow book chapter, peer-reviewed articles, and what is not. And somebody who's presenting a list of videos or different kinds of online conversations or the creation of networks using their expertise is at a significant disadvantage. So campuses that have tried to work on this, and again, the Mortgage College of Education at the University of Denver, IUPUI, UNCG, there are a number of campuses that have worked on this, actually provide a list of alternative products of scholarship that are in the guidelines so that it's clear that that these things can count if they are appropriately evaluated for the kinds of criteria that were mentioned before. If we can turn to the next slide. Also, I think in order to acknowledge newer forms of scholarship, we have, as well as newer entrants in particularly work that many women and underrepresented minority faculty are engaged in, we need to revise the norms we have for collaboration, the way we think about time in someone's career, and again, to acknowledge bias. So as was previously mentioned, we have a sort of bias in academe toward independence. I was thinking the other day, imagine if somebody right now in many research universities on your resume, we're asked to put some kind of a notation if we did a collaborative work about the percentage of the work that we did. And the reason is, the assumption is that we could be sort of getting away with something. Somebody else could be doing all of that work, and it's to show our independent thought and our contributions. Imagine if that was reversed, that we had to actually explain why it was that we needed to do those pieces by ourselves and couldn't have benefited from collaborating with colleagues in some interesting way that would have really benefited the work. So we need to think about ways to reform promotion and tenure policies that don't ding scholars that are involved in collaboration with colleagues in a variety of ways. There's an issue with trajectory. And many scholars have faced this in the humanities as well as in education and social sciences in particular. Many scholars in the sciences and STEM fields, where the norm is to go up, say, from associate to full from within a 5 or 6 year period, and they don't for a variety of different reasons that could be other than work related, or could be related to the production of books and different performance pieces. We need to think about somebody we create a bar and a set of criteria to come over, and to not assume that somebody who doesn't do that within a certain period of time shouldn't be able to cross that bar. The issue should be crossing the bar, doing the excellent work, not how long it necessarily took somebody to get there. The other issue is when someone comes into a conversation at an institution that has clearly identified newer forms of scholarship are something they want to value in their guidelines, and spends most of the conversation missing that in very concrete ways, trying to influence the conversation, just like if someone came in and was clearly being sexist or racist or homophobic toward a candidate in a promotion and tenure conversation, there need to be different ways in which that can be acknowledged and something can be done about that. And so many APT chairs are now going through trainings to acknowledge such issues of bias, and there are different ways in which that can be built in to decrease bias in the process. Peer review, if we go to the next slide, and this has again been a focus of the conference, I think the newer forms of scholarship movement has recognized for some time the need to expand our list of reviewers, not only beyond elitism to just say we can only have reviewers who are from certain research universities that are higher than yours in U.S. News and World Report, but also to make sure we follow into the field the work that people are doing. So again, if the point of the product is to actually impact public discussion or policy or law or what's going on in a doctor's office or in K through 12 classrooms, that we actually include reviewers in our processes from there. If we go to the next slide, I'll just observe that promotion and tenure is, of course, one organizational practice among many that our universities need to undertake for full inclusion and participation. And there are many others that connect with them really strongly. So, job descriptions that actually outline doing this work when someone comes in, and memorandum of understandings that say, hey, we all understand I'm going to be involved in this digital work. We all understand I'm going to be doing interdisciplinary or engaged scholarship. And we assume then that the products of that scholarship and the way I'm going to be evaluated through peer review will be reflective or contextualized to that. And many other things from promotion and tenure chair training to mentoring. So I'll finish up with my last conclusion slide, trying to make sure I get this in a shorter period of time. I think we need to recognize that even though the point is made almost every day and among folks who study faculty careers that the tenure process in some ways is becoming less important because of the greater percentage of people on the non-tenure track, it still maintains a significant motivational force in the lives of faculty in many universities and colleges across the United States and the world. And it's a signal of what an institution values, of what a field values, of who it values, as well as what it values. And so to the degree that we can actually get in there and make these changes, they provide the people doing this work a very strong message about who they want to include and advance and promote, where the institution wants to go in terms of 21st century making, and who they want at the table. And so I think these kinds of changes are really important to make. And like you, I'm very committed to helping campuses make them. Thank you.
Do we need to connect the computer? No, it's on that level. Okay. And our last speaker before the discussion is Josh Rosenblum, who is now on loan, I guess, at the National Science Foundation from University of Kansas. And he's been working in particular on star metrics and associated activities. Or that's why we invited him.
Okay. Okay. Wow. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I should start by saying that my day job at NSF is to manage a program called the Science of Science and Innovation Policy. And what I've heard over the last 2 days is really terrific food for thought about that. I mean, if you think about the kinds of changes that you're talking about making to the scientific enterprise, either at the level of how journals operate, at the level of how peer review operates, at the level of assessment that we've been talking about just now, and think about these from the perspective of approaching them as scientific questions, thinking systematically about what the goals that you want to accomplish are, and then thinking about how you can evaluate whether the changes that you're proposing actually move in that direction. Then you're thinking about science and innovation policy. So I hope that out there somewhere there may be a few investigators who will take a look at the program and think about it. But I'm here today to talk about the STAR Metrics program, with which I have been involved. I've been involved both at NSF, and before that I was involved with it at the University of Kansas when we became a participating institution. So I have a couple of different perspectives on that. I should start by saying pro forma and very honestly, what I'm going to say here reflects my personal assessment, and it's not the official position of the National Science Foundation or any other branch of the government. So they're all my opinions. Don't blame the NSF. Not that I hope you won't come away with that. What is STAR Metrics? STAR Metrics is a very clever acronym. It stands for Science and Technology for America's Reinvestment, measuring the effects of research on innovation, competitiveness, and science. They worked a really long time on that. Or they have a very good acronym generator. It was developed initially, remember the financial crash in 2008 and then the Recovery Act. STAR Metrics came out of some of the activity at that time. There was, as you recall, some stimulus funding. Some of it went to higher education and to research. And the government was being asked to be transparent about documenting the impact of that spending. And that got passed on to universities. I was in our research office, and I know that the research administrators in our office had a lot of headaches and a lot of sleepless nights worrying about how we were supposed to document the effects and report them back to the federal government. STAR Metrics was in part designed to solve that problem by providing a systematic, automated, and consistent way of reporting those effects. STAR Metrics consists of two distinct components, one of them level 1, which is I think probably more germane for most of the assessment questions here, and level 2. Level 1 is about the workforce and employment effects of science funding. Level 2 is in its current incarnation and interpretation about documenting the federal portfolio of research support. And somewhere in there's a connection which we haven't quite made, but we're working on that. If you want to read more about STAR Metrics, or if you'd like to join the enterprise, and we would be happy to have you, this is the URL that you should go to. It has a lot of information. Very briefly then, Level 1 is a federal university partnership. There are about 60 universities that are actively participating. They send us data every quarter. We send them back a jobs report. What it does is to leverage the administrative data that universities have in their financial and HR systems to produce an extract that documents who is employed at the university for what fraction of their time on individual grants. It also captures vendor payments, so purchases for things like mouse cages or laboratory supplies or other things that universities buy with research funding. It captures subcontracts, and it estimates the employment effects of the overhead payments that universities get along with the direct costs of research spending. Level 2 uses an entirely different set of data. It uses data that come from federal funding agencies, and it aggregates those. And there was a version up on the web. It went away because it wasn't production ready. It was proof of concept. We are very close to being able to release a new version to the public, which will allow you to do things like look at all of the grants that from different federal agencies that are active at UC Davis or any other campus, to look at grants by geographic location, and also to dig into them by topics across NSF, NIH, and other federal agencies. So it provides an integrated dashboard that looks at that. I'm going to show you a little bit of what we do with the data, and I'm showing you this is from the jobs report that gets sent back. This is from the University of Kansas. I hope that my colleagues there won't mind, but I don't think there's anything terribly explosive here. So one of the things you can find out is how many people were employed in on grants from different agencies. So this shows the numbers. You can also see this. You get this nifty time chart. You can see that faculty appointments, for example, on grants are very seasonal. Faculty tend to get put on grants in the summer when they're not on their 9-month appointments, which drives the people who have to do effort reporting crazy, but that's a different dispute. But so you get pictures like this that tell you something about who's employed, and what you can see here is that at a university like the University of Kansas, we probably have 600 different job titles that people who are employed on federal grants occupy. And one of the big effort here is in distilling that to, I think this is 8 categories that are uniform across everybody, so you can kind of compare them. You can see how many technicians are employed, how many clinical researchers, things like that. You also get a picture of employment. These are the vendor payments, so this shows you who's supplying things to the university with research funding. So that's sort of the picture. And so from the point of view of assessment, which was what I was asked to talk about, I think that the key point here is that there's interesting data in university administrative systems, and StarMetrics is one example of ways in which that can be captured, that information can be captured. The report that StarMetrics generates is, in a sense, the tip of the iceberg of the things you can learn. There are a number of projects that are making use of the StarMetrics data in other ways. For example, the data that universities generate is very granular. It has there are 4 data tables. One data table has every individual who's supported. Another one has all the grants, and so you can link these up in that wonderful way that databases can be linked, and you can track all this stuff. And so what you can do with that, for example, is you can investigate collaboration networks on your campus. You can see collaboration that is incipient. You don't have to wait for publications, for example. And you can see who are the individuals who occupy strategic nodes in research networks. And they're not always the people who you would see from the publication data. So you might find that the scientist who operates the magnetic resonance imaging equipment on campus is really a key point of contact for many other researchers, and may actually be serving as a bridge between different research groups. So you can identify characteristics like that. In the longer run, there's the potential, although it is fraught with difficulty, to track graduate students and postdocs beyond campus boundaries. So StarMetrics associates with these individuals a unique but anonymized identifier, but in campus systems, of course, you have a social security number, which can be connected, for example, through the longitudinal employer databases that have been built up. You can track people's employment subsequently if you can get access to those census and IRS data, which involves getting a lot of clearance. It's a headache. There are people who are working on trying to make that more streamlined, but it opens up the potential to be able to follow people through scientific careers and see the effects of mentorship and postdoctoral advising, for example, and to evaluate some of those activities in a systematic and scientific way. So all good science starts with measurement. STAR metrics is a new tool for measurement, and with that, I'll stop.
All right, we can have the speakers up to the table. And do we have the roving microphones going around? Just wait 1 second while we get Carrie-Anne all set up there. All right. I think we'll just open it to questions. Yeah, there are a few.
Yep. I just want to follow up on what Josh said about mentoring, which I think is something that we entirely overlook in assessment, and it's criminal. It's insane. How do graduate students and postdocs refer to professors? PI, mentor, advisor. We promote, hire, and award tenure based on your principal investigator capacity, not based on how you mentor and how you advise. And the reason it's crazy is because a lot of the good mentoring comes at the expense of your publication output. It comes at the expense of making progress on all the things that we do assess. And the real reason that it's insane is because when you think of the value to society, the lifetime output, I would argue, of a professor with what I will discover in my lab is minimal compared to the impact on society from training students and being a good mentor and being a good advisor. And the fact that we don't think about it and don't include it in tenure decisions is just insane.
Thank you. That's a terrific point, and I absolutely agree with you that if we think about scholarship as being about adding to the stock of knowledge in some sense, whether it's through the discovery of new things or the promotion of new ways of interpreting and understanding facts that are already known, then mentoring is, and students who are trained are really a very important output. And just point out Paul Stefan, who is probably the leading scholar of the economics of science, has made the point that one of the best ways to communicate an idea is to wrap it up in a person.
I thought you might have something to say about that.
All right. I agree that in all of the cases that I have seen, there has been very little evidence that mentoring is measured as part of a promotion and tenure assessment. I also wanted to say that leads into the following unwanted outcomes, that there is a belief that mentoring students is not as an important part of a faculty's mission. We have also in this university, more than any other universities that I have seen, we have a low graduate student to faculty ratio on this campus, which is, we have many more postdocs, and so I'm talking more about the sciences right now. The postdoc to faculty ratio is much higher than I have seen on any other campuses than the graduate student to faculty ratio, which really, together with the mentoring and or lack of it, lack of assessing mentoring as part of the assessment, really translates into a lesser importance given to the having graduate students as part of our research enterprise. And this is something that needs to worry, they should worry us, because a measure of success of a public research university, especially in the sciences, is the number of graduate students you are training in our labs and the quality of mentoring we provide. I would like to disagree with the individual who spoke. While we agree on the importance of mentoring, I disagree that mentoring takes away from the productivity of the faculty. It's a wrong perception, either in the near term or the long term. If the graduate students are the ones who produce science in your laboratories, that mentoring becomes an integral part of producing something in your lab. And in that respect, I see it as an absolutely critical component to staying productive.
Hold that down. Working? Okay. You know, I don't think that's true in my discipline, because our productivity is measured in books and peer-reviewed articles, and it really has affected both women and minority faculty who feel, rightly or wrongly, but I think they're right, that when they are spending hours and hours reading a graduate student's dissertation, they are not reading something that is directly related to the thing they have to publish in the next year in order to get a merit review. So timing and the different tempos that we use for our work it's just critical.
Well, we do not disagree, because I mentioned that I was speaking more about the sciences. I do agree, however, that by placing this as a critical component of what we consider to be productivity and what we consider to be a driver towards excellence for all of us in the university, eventually we have to account for the time that a faculty member in the humanities and social sciences, or in those disciplines where the faculty has to work individually towards their quality of scholarship. I think it's critical to incorporate it there. There is another issue, if I may say, about mentoring. It's not just mentoring graduate students. It's about mentoring junior faculty. And that is missing as well from both, now across the disciplines. This is not something that I have seen as part of the portfolios for senior faculty who are assessed for performance. And it's something that I have seen across the board, not just here on our campus at UC Davis, but on other campuses as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to join in on the conversation about mentoring. I think one of the other things about it is the degree to which it's so individualized. It just maintains so many of the processes we have about independent, principal investigator. In other words, we put so much onus on individual faculty to mentor individual students, just like we put so much onus on department chair training to have great, awesome department chairs. But then when they leave, if the organizational practices are not embedded, then we just have to train another individual great department chair, right? Steal them from each other, kind of thing, across the country. And I think that so much of the mentoring literature is talking now about constellations of mentors. We don't need one, we in different areas of our professional life. And so even though I know it's experimental in some ways, and yet because of lab work in the sciences, perhaps less so in some disciplines, the concept of having 3 or 4 people really as strong mentors, if not more, in your field, seems to be to set us up for more collaboration later than the sort of you're wedded to your faculty members' research, or that person better be a really awesome mentor or you're in trouble. I think that that's part of our problem, is the individualization of that process.
In some ways, I agree, and in some other ways, I disagree. I think mentoring should be a two-way relationship. There should be in mentoring something for both the mentee and the mentor. And if you are to develop a strong relationship, I cannot see how you can retain multiple mentors at the same time. It is true that we could have in our professional career, intellectual life, if you like, many mentors who have played a role at different times. But it takes a lot of emotional and real time that needs to be invested in mentorship. And how can you sustain it if we cannot have one? How can we sustain it in many? And then I also think that a mentee and a mentor know each other really well in ways that not too many others know about both of them. It's a very deep relationship. It's a relationship that is based on trust, on respect, and on the knowledge that each one of them will do the best they can to maintain, and they will invest in this relationship for a long time. I personally have to say, as an assistant professor, I could not have more than one and do that, develop. Superficial relationships could exist among many people, but not with a true mentor.
We all know that you get what you measure, and I'm wondering if you could speak to the trade-off between this relentless pressure to demonstrate impact and reform peer review and all of these other things we've been talking about, with our desire to let people be innovative and work at their own pace. These seem like inherently contradictory goals, but I feel them both very strongly. So could you just give your thoughts about the balance of these two pressures, given all this reform and change that we're experiencing?
You were looking at me, I think, but I'm assuming that was directed to the panel. So maybe we should start with Sarah and Margie and work our way out.
Well, I think one of the biggest pressures in peer review, in faculty review, tenure review, all of that is the intensity of the experience of what you have to read and look at. So numbers are always going to help that. Creating numbers that try to, or that are successful in limiting bias, I think, is the most important thing, because I just don't think numbers are going to go away.
Say something, we all get what we measure. Was that your statement? Well, I suppose that the set of alternatives that Kant thought up, didn't think up, he formulated in terms of utilitarian and critique. Those are different activities. The critique would be saying, we have some things we can't yet measure. We don't actually know how to measure these things. And so maybe it's not just that we get what we measure, but we also need to be saying, what can't we measure? And in the ways that we have been measuring them. And I think that that's what this conference is actually doing. And that's what makes it exciting. What other things could we measure? Would there be a way in which that pressure that you're feeling could be alleviated productively, Or do you need that pressure to be making those decisions?
The issue with the measurement is that the metric itself may become the constraint. And it's only human for people to know how you measure an entity. And then eventually to take the next step and take those measurements that have characterized what we think high quality work and create that as a guide. And then that eventually forces people to behave accordingly. This is the same issue we have with K-12. The moment you have a metric to try to assess the quality, then everybody teaches around that metric. And so the question that I have is that how can you measure quality without creating then perceptions about what is acceptable or what is sought after, and so to force individuals to act under that, according to that perception.
Well, I'm of two minds on this question. I go back and forth. I think that we are, I think, in some ways under an obligation to push back against the relentless demand to demonstrate the relevance and the immediate economic returns, in particular, of what we do in higher education and the investments that we make in science. I think that it's really important in building a science of science, for example, to understand how science works. And it doesn't work in the linear model that people talked about in the 1940s. It really does contribute to a stock of knowledge which makes its way out into the world in very complicated ways. And in that context, negative results in science are equally as useful and valuable in expanding that stock of knowledge, because they tell us where not to invest resources in the future. But they don't lead to they don't necessarily lead to patents or economic benefits that we can attribute directly. And so I keep having this argument with folks in the federal government, all of whom want to know where should they spend their science money. And I keep telling them you can't do it that way. On the other hand, I think that, we are all forced, we are obliged in one way or another to make judgments. In a university at various levels, we're allocating scarce resources to different disciplines and departments and schools, and those wind up being reflected in hiring decisions, in promotion decisions, in the allocation of resources for laboratories and buildings and equipment and all sorts of things. And they are inherently judgments about quality and value. And we had a discussion at Kansas, which I was fortunate to be part of, about measurement in the humanities, and we kept going around and around about this question, but you can't measure what we do. And I kept saying, well, but somehow you know what's good and what isn't, and we need to talk about what that is you're looking at, even if it isn't something that you can count exactly. We need to know what it is, because you're forming a judgment. You're forming a judgment based on something. So that's why I'm of two minds. I mean, we have to make decisions, we have to look at something, but I think we also owe society to push back against the call for demonstrating economic impacts of everything we do.
I just wanted to mention there's a great quote by Michael Nilsson. In science, as in so many parts of life, what gets measured is what gets rewarded, and what gets rewarded is what gets done. I think measurements are really dangerous if not used properly, and they're really good for smart people, and they're really bad for inexperienced or inexperienced people. But I think, for instance, with the collaboration score that I'm trying to create, it's not a measurement, and so it's not really in anybody's consciousness at all. So that's the problem.
So I just wanted to follow up on that comment. The Germans don't call science science; they call it Wissenschaft. So it's the craft of knowledge, it's the judgment, and the development of that judgment ability, and that's more than scholarship, I guess, and it's more than research, and it's more than empirical deduction, and so on. And I think language is very, very important in what we're talking about. What a humanist can say, well, they're developing judgment, they're criticizing judgment, and so on, and that's recognizable to them, but it's not, it's not accountable in the sense that the federal government wants it. So I agree. We have to push back, and we have to recognize these many, many ways of judging in terms of synthesis, in terms of salience, in terms of wisdom. And many, many disciplines value those different aspects of scholarship. So those are concepts, they're definable, they're recognizable. You could create like a fuzzy logic set to recognize them, but those are the types of metrics I think we really need.
Yeah. Okay. So this is sort of some half-formed thoughts, but I'm wondering if some of the issues around this, some of the issues around assessment and the tensions around it are almost because universities sometimes kind of feel like a sort of a cartel, where there's sort of more or less interchangeable institutions all struggling to outcompete one another along very similar kinds of rankings, very similar kinds of metrics. And there's a lot of pressure within faculty, too, to have them sort of cross-compatible, too, because faculty might want to move from university to university, et cetera. And you get all these sort of perversions and weird incentives and conformity associated with that, because there's all of these institutions have very similar kinds of goals and ways of organizing themselves. And I'm wondering if part of what we need, if we're wanting to build out, give researchers more autonomy, more freedom of latitude in how to conduct research and scholarship, is more diverse institutional forms that where different forms of evaluations, different kinds of metrics can be developed or not developed depending on the sort of needs of smaller kinds of research communities and constituencies. And I'm wondering, is this a public policy kind of a thing that we should be advocating for also, not just sort of, I'm coming at this from the background of trying to reform scholarly communications, but the sort of institutional context of scholarly communications is one of the biggest problems that we're always butting up against. Is that something that we really need to focus a lot more attention on?
Josh.
Put me on the spot again. Well, I read last year Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovative University, in which he argues for a greater diversity of institutional goals. Of course, he's advocating that many more institutions really ought to focus more on their undergraduate education mission. Now, I think that, that in some sense, if you look at the history of the last 60 years, what happened was that the nation as a whole went through a period of very dramatic expansion of its research capacity. After Sputnik, the federal government expanded the flow of research funding, and many institutions, including mine, which had respectable programs in a limited number of areas that were largely tied to local economic characteristics in some sense, expanded and became much more comprehensive, broad-based research institutions. And that is an ecosystem which in some sense is sustainable as long as the funding flow is growing, and it has stopped in large part, and I'm sure Linda can speak to this much more directly than I can, but states have pulled back dramatically. The federal funding has slowed down, and in some sense we may be at a point when rather than continuing to expand, we may be seeing some contraction, and it's going to be messy.
So I would like to speak about the organization vis-a-vis the individual faculty member. If you look at this as the human unit, all right, that creates the university. I would say that the process for assessing organizational excellence is fundamentally different, and the metrics are different from the one we are discussing about the individual. An organization which is a community of many individual scholars can act differently, and we could have different expectations about how this organization acts from how an individual could or should act, and what kind of expectations we have on the individual. So for example, we always say that a university has a multifaceted mission. So it needs to educate, it needs to create new knowledge and create the utility as you're referring to, and then of course it needs to communicate with, to connect with the community, to really have this outreach component. A university as an organization should do all of those three and should really do well in each of those facets. An individual faculty could not be expected to excel in all three. We would like to have an individual faculty member to excel at least in one, but there should not be an expectation that excels in all three, even if the expectation for the organization is that we have excellence in all directions. So there are easier metrics for an organization than there are for an individual. And also when the university looks at the individual faculty member, and that's what the argument was, when I look at how the assessment processes have impacted not the individual faculty but the organization. Specific elements of the assessment process, at least from the organizational perspective, seem to be useless. And I will explain why. You can argue that for a small group of faculty, retaining somebody through the tenure process or letting somebody go, of course for the individual is a huge impact, for a small group is an important impact, for the university is no impact. When you think that we have 4,000 faculty, all right, both tenure track, clinical, research, and lectures in education, letting go 5% every year, or keeping that 5% every year of the tenure track faculty is in the noise in the organization. And my argument is that the impact is minimal. Now, that is not true for the small unit or for the individual, obviously, but as you go up and you abstract in the organization, all right, for the organization, I'd rather not give tenure to everyone and then create the appropriate conditions where the individuals will do the best they can. And as you know, the process for excellence, I would call it a very messy process. You need a lot of people who will try to do a lot of wonderful things, so a few things are really breakthrough. But you cannot expect everybody to do that. And I think we as an organization, if we try to achieve that excellence, we need to be ready to have everybody in the spectrum. And we need to be able to have an environment that would allow this to happen, all right? Talking about the conditions. So an organization is trying to create conditions for a faculty to do well. We will not be right for the organization to force the faculty to do specific things. That's not important. And I think that's a mistake also. So how do you create conditions for faculty to do well? Of course, the investment, the appropriate investments in areas that will allow them to do what they can do the best. You cannot, I am against forcing faculty to do interdisciplinary work if that is not going to let them do the best they can. I think they need to select what they can do best, and that will be the primary responsibility for the institution. It is also always a worry in the sciences. I'm going to the sciences right now. It is always has been a worry that funding will not be enough so every individual investigator can be supported well. So that's number one. That's why, on one end, we have encouraged faculty to work together and to go for bigger centers. At the same time, we all know that big problems require a lot of expertise, and therefore we would like to have many PIs who bring that expertise to come together and solve that bigger problem. But I have to say my argument would be that those PIs will find each other. And forcing them to come together is not something that the institution should have done. So if we had a lot of money, it would have been inappropriate for the institution to force people to come into big groups and do collaborative work. We would only need to eliminate the intellectual boundaries, make sure that our policies and processes allow the faculty to flow, and we do not provide restrictions in that regard. And I have to say, creative people find their way to where they should be. And given given what they need, can excel. And of course, at the end, the organization will.
I have a different, I moved locations. A different angle on the sort of assessment, which is we've been focusing a lot on the review of junior faculty or review of institutions or review of sort of senior scholars. We have a lot of grad students and postdocs here and also all around the world, of course. And I'm wondering if the panel can comment on what would you recommend that they do right now? Not what are we going to change. I mean, I think it is our responsibility, all of us, to change the field to make the reward system work better and to make the review system work better and so on. But it hasn't changed yet completely. So what does second-year graduate student, what should they be thinking about? Should they imagine that big changes are going to happen in 3 years, in 5 years, never? And I'm just wondering if you have any idea of like what recommendations for the more junior people going into academia. Yeah. I have this effect.
Jonathan, I think you can answer that better. You have grad students, but I mean, without any of these changes, I mean, would it be great for them to blog because altmetrics is starting to take hold? Or would it be better for them to go the standard route of writing that paper that might get into Nature?
I make them blog, he said.
Okay, so blog.
No, I mean, I think that there are lots of things young people will do anyway, but I think it is our responsibility to be realistic about what's going to change and what their sort of context is.
Well, I was just at the molecular medicine conference earlier in the week, TRICON, and I had dinner with a bunch of young investigators. Actually, they all were assistant professors, but felt they were going to lose their grants any minute. They were working on the ENCODE project, which is a big collaborative project, and bemoaning the fact that because they had to spend time on that and they had very little grant money to do it, that there was just, it was almost useless to them, that it wasn't going to help them in any way because there was no way to measure what performance they had on that grant. So of course we were talking about my C-score, but what would they do right now? I mean, they all felt like they were in a really big crisis because they said they were quoting Francis Collins' quote in the Chronicle about, funding now just has to go to the superstars. We are not really looking at projects anymore. I think it's bleak, and so, but I'm too far away from it to really know how to give advice.
I think that it's bleak, too, and I think of Yochai Benker's statement that we need to be looking for the productively sustainable, which is a paradox, perhaps. But in my part of the university, that 73% of the professoriate that is off the tenure track is huge. It's not sustainable. I can't tell anybody to go to graduate school. Where are they going to go? We've given up on the idea that education is a public good. Across the disciplines, it seems to me, and I think that started in California with Proposition 13, and that, as I understand its history, happened partly because there were many middle-class white people who decided that they could take their kids out and put them in private schools. I mean, this is a huge social issue, but I don't like the language of crisis, but I have to say that, if we're thinking about the public good, we need to think about something that is not operating by the same standard of profit as we already are engaged with. And this is where I might disagree with Linda. It seems to me that the organization, the good of the organization and the good of the individual students as well as faculty in it are tied up in some of the same networks of deciding what is the value of the kind of work we're doing. So I think we're actually, we don't have anything to offer the next generation except an unbelievable kind of competition. And who is going to rise to the top? It's not merit necessarily. It's an accident.
So I like this debate. So let me just say one thing. When I spoke, I want to clarify, when I spoke about the organization, of course the good of the faculty and the good of the students is the good of the organization. But when I talked about achieving excellence in the organization and what metrics we're using, those cannot be the same with the individuals. That's all that I said, all right? Beyond that, I'm not as pessimistic. I remember myself in '84 when I was looking for a faculty position and how many hundreds of individuals were applying for a few faculty positions. There are many more and bigger institutions right now. Faculty do retire. It is true that we have produced many more. There is one area of concern, and that's in the life sciences, all right? So I will say that. But in general, I would say that the graduate students need to go for whatever their heart wants to do. And my belief is that they will be able to succeed as long as they don't limit their options themselves. Could I finish a moment? I'm sorry, it came from the computer. So, so the only thing I want to say is that universities do recruit faculty. Our institution is going to hire 300 new faculty. With retirements, our estimate is that we are going to recruit and hire 700 new faculty by 2020. And I know we are only one institution, but there will be 700 new positions across the disciplines. So I don't want to tell our graduate students that it is worse than it was before. As a matter of fact, as a female faculty, it was a lot worse in '84 than it is now, because we did not at the time have the sensitivity that we have right now. And I'm not suggesting that the universities have solved the problems in diversity, but now we are a lot more sensitized to the issues. At the time, it was a totally different environment. So I would have to say, I don't want to make the young faculty, the young students feel that this is the end. I would like to tell them that they need to continue with their passion, and they need to find exactly where their passion will take them. And eventually, yes, there is competition. There was always competition in the fields we've been in. But I just believe, however, that we do not educate them for nothing.
Carrie Ann?
Yes, actually, what I was going to say is pretty complimentary to your chancellor's comments. I say it's Valentine's Day. Fall in love with what you do. You know, I mean, I tell my graduate students all the time that are interested in being faculty members, it is competitive. It is a new appointment set of structures and funding realities, but it's one of the best jobs in the world. I mean, seriously, it's one of the best. I truly love what I do, and if somebody is meant to go that path, I think that there's still a way to do it. For me, that would be one, as was mentioned before, one really awesome Uber mentor, but also a constellation of mentors. It would mean being very strategic about a portfolio of ways in which you're writing and doing your science and your scholarship and all of the other kinds of work you're doing. So you might be blogging, but you are also, of course, trying to get into different kinds of publications. You know, it's all that career development kinds of stuff, but the most important thing is that you fall down the rabbit hole of what you love to do, you know, and then you just become understood to be one of the very best people doing that work out of that love of that work. And I think a path opens for itself after that, after you're strategic about your network and putting yourself out there and assuming agency every time you see a possible opportunity. But I would have to say that I also am optimistic that there's still chances and pathways for folks that want a career.
Mario, you have the last.
Yes, so I'm quite surprised that nobody has tried to respond to the interesting idea that Linda has put on the table about the different scenarios about hiring, tenure, and so on. So I have a question about that, but I also wanted to register a little bit of a concern about the term mentorship. That you know, one thing, I mean, it's a term that I think should be perhaps qualified. You know, mentorship of graduate students is one thing. Mentorship of junior faculty is a completely different thing. Junior faculty are not students, they're professionals. And in some institutions I've been involved with, I've seen the so-called mentoring of junior faculty that was what I would have called old boys network, or in more recent days, you know, young girls networks. So I think we need to be careful about the mentoring of, I think junior faculty should know exactly what is expected of them, and things should be as transparent as possible rather than they having to rely on, you know, advice from senior colleagues. So back to the tenure thing. So I thought that, so first of all, it's an interesting idea. You probably, if you're interested in trying to articulate further, you may find some evidence from the CNRS in France, where people are effectively are hired into research position with employment security from day one. So that could, I mean, of course, there is very little teaching there. There is also very little money, but that could provide some evidence. The other thing is that in the UK, things are actually not very different from what you're suggesting, because when somebody's hired as a lecturer, typically him or her are put on what they call a probation, but the probation can be like 2 or 3 years. So, and coming out of probation is not like tenure, right? So So there are a couple of things that one could use to see if they're. So, but the main question is this. So on one side, so it seems to me that your proposal or idea, I don't know if you mean it as a proposal or as just a thought object. Okay, so your idea. So still, first of all, it's not clear whether it excludes metrics because if you are considering an applicant to a junior position, that person will still have to be evaluated, and metrics, and at this point, students come in with articles, sometimes several of them. So it doesn't really answer the issue of metrics. So what it does is that you would say, look, dear department, you need to do a good job because this is a risky and high investment moment, so please read what these people have written, and have a conversation. But then you have all the other steps. You mentioned people's salary is going to go up. So there is going to be an evaluation. So what I'm saying is that you are just getting rid of one element of the evaluation, but everything else remains in place.
So you are correct, but this early step is my own thoughts on this. I have seen over so many years that I have been engaged with this process on so many different campuses, that the first 7 years are the most formative years of a scholar. After they go on their own, especially in the sciences, because in the humanities it's different, the students have their own thesis and so forth. In the sciences, while you're a student, you work very close with your advisor, your mentor. You have not developed independence yet. So the time for independence comes when you become a faculty member. That's where all of your creative ideas can take root. And then you take the most low-risk path in that, so you continue with your work a little bit. So all of your creative and breakthrough and out-of-the-box ideas, that's not the time to apply them. So my fear is, as I have seen, that it takes 7 years, which are the most formative years of a researcher, I would say, and then as a scholar, maybe in the humanities you can correct me, but I think also very important years, all right, when a humanist, as a scholar, develops his or her own questions, and they develop their own critique about issues and so forth, and then forces them to do whatever will be acceptable to get tenure. What would happen? So I'm asking a question. What would happen if we do have, as we do now, we keep a very intense process for recruiting and hiring, and then when faculty come, they know they will be assessed, obviously, for progress, but they know that they will not have to go through that period where they don't know whether they're going to continue. So they will have the ability to be creative, even at the cost of not producing too early. Because if you start working on new things, you will not have the outcome that will then be coming early to be counted towards your tenure case. In my case, I remember I had to wait until I got tenure for me to really apply what I always wanted to do. This is very unfair, for a young person, because in many areas, well, unfortunately, but the best ideas, we have them when we are young, I think. So, in some ways, all right?
But different fields are quite different, so
True.
there is a risk about using one's experience as...
No, but I think also, well, I will make another then statement, and you can...
And then we'll cut it off.
Yes. The other statement is that I think we are all become biased by our own scholarship. And it becomes difficult as time goes by. It has nothing to do with age. But as more and more people invest themselves in particular areas, that bias, I believe, becomes the biggest barrier. That is a generalization, and obviously there are many, many exceptions to that. But I think, as I said, when I look at this organization from the top, where you lose the perspective of the individual and you look at our intellectual community as one, and you see what is happening and how this community produces and becomes creative and all of this. I personally think that those regulations we have, too many of them, really keep the community down in terms of their creativity. So.
Okay, I'd like to thank all the speakers in the panel very much.